ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Our defence alliance with the United States seems to be a given. But do we really need the Americans to protect us? The former PM, Paul Keating, doesn't think so. He insists we can defend ourselves, and he wants to tear up a nuclear submarine deal we've done with them. Today, Richard McGregor from the Lowy Institute on what that would mean for our security. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Richard, the former Prime Minister Paul Keating, he never really has held back, and he was at it again during an interview with my colleague Sarah Ferguson on 7:30 last week.
Paul Keating, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you, Sarah.
Really questioning why we have to have military ties with the United States.
If we didn't have an aggressive ally, like the United States, aggressive to others in the region, there'd be nobody attacking Australia. You don't need the United States to defend Australia. Australia's quite capable of defending itself. We don't need to be basically a pair of shoes hanging out of the American backside.
Did you see that? And just broadly, what was your view at the time?
Well, it's really what we expect from Keating. We know his views. He's adamant about them and is very keen to air them at any particular point. So there was no real surprise. I guess what is interesting about it is two things: that he still has the ability to cut through in the public debate, and that he probably does have support, at least for the way he makes his arguments, amongst some in the Labor Party, certainly within the Greens, maybe some in the community.
We are better left alone than we are being protected by an aggressive power like the United States.
His argument, Richard, is that a close alliance with the United States actually puts us more at risk, that we will become the 51st state of the United States. So his main concern is Australian sovereignty is diminished. Is there any merit to that argument?
Well, governments around the world, pull their sovereignty all the time. We diminish our sovereignty because we sign up to a set of global rules. We diminish our sovereignty through a whole bunch of international agreements. So no country, except maybe the superpowers, are truly sovereign in that respect. Do we diminish our sovereign ability to act as we would want in national security? I mean, to a degree we do, but I think it's a very conscious trade-off by the Australian government. It has been for a long time with the US alliance. We might have overdone that in the past, in other words, signing up to all American military wars offshore, some of which now look very poorly planned and executed in retrospect, particularly the Second Iraq War.
We are determined to join other countries to deprive Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. There's also another reason, and that is our close security alliance with the United States.
But yes, there's a diminution of sovereignty, but are we more sovereign if we simply cut ourselves off from the United States? Is our national security better protected? Are we more able to defend ourselves? If you get into that, well, I would say no. Of course, there's a real debate to be had about US intentions, but the idea that we simply adjunct our sovereignty by having an alliance with the United States doesn't seem right to me.
Well, Mr. Keating says we can actually protect ourselves. We don't even need support from the United States if we were under attack in some sort of way.
What is a threat? And that is an invasion. An invasion comes in an armada. With satellites today, you see the armada formed. You would see it leave its harbour. You would see it for 10 or 15 days come to Australia, and you would sink every one of them on the way.
Well, look, that may or may not be the case. Would we be spending more or less money if we did that? what would be the capabilities that we would need to do that? I guess the real nub of Mr. Keating's argument, and it's a real debate, is that by committing ourselves to the nuclear power submarines, to both buying American submarines, having some stationed here, and then in theory building them, that we are really tying ourselves to American war plans in Asia and over Taiwan if it comes to that. Now, that's not an unreasonable argument, but he excludes all other possibilities, which is simply that we are isolated in that we have no skin on the game, that we are bystanders in the upheaval that's happening in the region now. And of course, in a very cold-blooded fashion, Australia's been through a period of Chinese coercion in recent years. If we were to cut ourselves off from the United States, we lose the best intelligence network in the world. We would no longer have access to the best military technology in the world. And don't think that the United States can't coerce us as well. So, it's a kind of choice we have to make.
Of course, one of the most controversial things he said during that interview, Richard, is that Taiwan is Chinese real estate that we have no national interest in.
And the Americans are going to say, no, we're going to keep these Taiwanese people protected, even though they're sitting on Chinese real estate. I mean, does anyone want their kids to be shot to death on a sandy beach in Taiwan? Australian kids shot to death on a sandy beach.
Nancy Pelosi, the former US House Speaker, has been on 7:30 as well, and she just says it's a stupid comment.
That's ridiculous. It is not Chinese real estate, and he should know that. Taiwan is Taiwan, and it's of the people of Taiwan who have a democracy there. I have no idea about Keating, but I think it was a stupid statement to make. And I
think the real point is a point he's made elsewhere, which is much more debatable, is that do we have a national interest in the type of government in Taiwan, or do we have a national interest in preserving Taiwan as it does, and as an effectively autonomous democratic state, or standing aside while China takes it over? And by the way, if China did take over Taiwan, it would dismember the democracy there piece by piece. Let's be clear about that. Thousands, tens of thousands perhaps would flee and go to jail. So it's not a sort of nice sort of thing to contemplate, even just out of the national interest question. But do we have a national interest in that? I'd say what we do have is a national interest in stability in the region, a national interest in effectively keeping the ability of middle powers like Australia and many other countries in Southeast Asia to still have autonomy, to still have skin in the game. And most of all, we get that, not just Australia, but Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, in some respects, maybe Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore, that we get that from the American presence in Asia.
And of course, Richard, we're talking about this again now because the Defence Minister and Foreign Minister have just been in Washington for talks about AUKUS, which is, of course, the deal between Australia, the US and the UK for developing nuclear-powered submarines.
Yeah, look, I think the biggest issue about AUKUS is it's the three-way process. First, we have US nuclear-powered submarines based in Australia, in Perth. Then we're going to buy a couple, in theory, if the Americans can build them. And then, in theory, we're going to build a different one with the UK. Now, each of those processes is an enormous thing. And I think the more compelling critique of AUKUS is by former Prime Minister, another former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull.
I do not believe we will ever get any nuclear submarines from the Americans. Essentially, in the United States Navy, the most valuable strategic assets are their Virginia-class submarines. The American Navy is short between 17 and 20 short of what they believe they need. And the legislation relating to this deal, the American legislation says that before any submarine can be sold to Australia, the US president has to certify that their Navy doesn't need it.
There is a genuine doubt or debate about whether the Americans will have the shipbuilding capacity to build submarines for us, because, of course, Congress will say if they haven't got enough for themselves, then they won't sell them to us. They'll keep them for the United States, as you'd expect. And then there's the issue of whether we can actually execute the construction of a submarine ourselves with the British. So Mr Turnbull's argument is we might get none at all.
And so the reality is the Americans will not part with the Virginia-class submarines. They're saying, you Aussies, you took the risk, you saw the legislation, we can only give them to you if we don't need them.
There is the concern as well, of course, about the cost, which is something like $370 billion between now and 2050.
Yes.
The other concern is that the public is being kept in the dark, that there's these negotiations going on in secret and they're not being fully explained to voters what's happening.
Yes, look, on the cost, yes, it is a lot of money. The cost is already unpopular. And on the secrecy, you're absolutely right. We seem to be addicted to secrecy in the bureaucracy in Australia, somehow thinking the public can't manage the debate, the politicians can't manage the debate. And, I think political leaders should be very careful about that, because if an overly sort of secret, paranoid management of this program won't help it. We're going to spend all this money, then the public's got to get behind it. And I don't think they are at the moment.
So that takes me back then, Richard, to Paul Keating and his arguments. I guess if the public are left in the dark largely about what we're committing to, they could be swayed by the sort of argument that Paul Keating's putting forward.
Yeah, look, it's possible he'll win the debate, maybe not. I think the bulk of the Australian population now, I think, believes we need to spend more on defence. We need to bolster our defences. We probably need the best kit that we can get, that we want to have some options in dealing with a rising China. I still think the bigger problem is not the 51st state one. I think the bigger one is the industrial issue of whether the Americans can build them, the Australians and the UK can build them. It's quite possible that falls down and then we're left with nothing at all. And that is a real issue of sovereignty, because then we'll have little to defend ourselves, let alone join any other military exercises and the like, perhaps conflicts in the region.
All right, so just tell me, Richard, what do you think? Could we really defend ourselves if war was to break out in our region? Or is the idea of ending the US alliance just utter nonsense?
Well, we can have a US alliance without AUKUS, by the way. It might survive only just if it unravelled. Yes, we could defend ourselves, but if we're an ally with the United States, then the United States would also be potentially part of that defence. I think in that respect, the alliance is extremely valuable. So I think the real issue is not about an attack on Australia. It's about what role that we decide we'll take in the broader upheaval in the Asia-Pacific and in the contest between the US and China. Are we all in with the United States? Do we actually, in the event of a conflict with Taiwan, join that? I think they're much bigger issues than the actual defence of Australia.
Richard McGregor is a Senior Fellow for East Asia at the Lowy Institute. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.